of the old Toyota sputtered faintly as it came to a stop outside the upscale apartment building. The car, a relic of better times long past, was a muted gray that looked almost apologetic in the glow of the streetlights. The man behind the wheel, Daniel, ran a hand through his neatly combed hair, exhaling deeply. His palms were sweaty despite the crispness of the evening air, and the faint scent of his drugstore cologne filled the car. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror. His tired brown eyes stared back, framed by an expression of nervous determination. Tonight was important, and despite the pit in his stomach, he was resolved to make a good impression. He glanced up at the towering building before him. Every window glimmered like a silent testament to the wealth and privilege housed within. She lived here. Isabella, the woman he'd been daydreaming about since their first meeting at the local cafe 2 weeks ago. She'd breezed into the small shop like she owned the air around her, her sharp heels clicking against the tiled floor, her designer handbag casually slung over her arm. She was stunning, tall, poised, and exuding a confidence that seemed almost otherworldly. Their first conversation had been brief, but unforgettable. She'd asked for a recommendation on the menu, and he, a part-time barista filling in for a sick coworker, had nervously suggested the house blend. Something in his earnestness must have intrigued her because she'd smiled, a radiant, disarming smile, and lingered longer than necessary, asking about his day. It wasn't much, but it had been enough for him to gather the courage to ask for her number. To his surprise, she'd given it with a playful smirk, as if accepting a dare. But now, sitting in his ancient car that reeked faintly of worn upholstery, Daniel felt the vast gulf between them more acutely than ever. She came from a world of polished elegance and effortless affluence, while he was a man barely scraping by, juggling 2 jobs and nursing dreams of a brighter future. Still, he refused to let that intimidate him. Tonight was his chance to show her who he was, beyond the old car, beyond the empty wallet. He stepped out of the car, smoothing down his second-hand blazer, and walked toward the building's entrance. She was already waiting in the lobby, framed by the golden glow of the chandelier above. Isabella was breathtaking in a crimson dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her makeup flawless, her posture regal. For a moment, Daniel felt like an imposter in her world. But then she turned, her eyes meeting his, and he mustered a smile. "Hey!" he greeted her warmly, trying to ignore the way her gaze flicked over him and his car parked outside. "Hi," she replied, her tone polite but lacking the warmth he'd imagined. Her eyes darted toward the Toyota, and her brows lifted ever so slightly. "Is that your car?" she asked, her voice tinged with something between disbelief and disdain. "Yeah," Daniel admitted, his cheeks flushing. "It's old, but it gets the job done." She let out a soft, almost amused laugh. "It certainly has character," she remarked, though her words dripped with thinly veiled condescension. The ride to the restaurant was painfully quiet. Isabella had her phone out, scrolling through social media with disinterest, while Daniel tried to focus on the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The date was not off to the start he'd hoped for. The restaurant was a modest Italian place Daniel had chosen carefully. It wasn't extravagant, but it was cozy and renowned for its authentic dishes. He'd been saving up for weeks to make tonight special. Yet, as they stepped inside, he caught the slight downturn of Isabella's lips. She didn't say anything, but the way she glanced around at the simple decor spoke volumes. As they were seated, Daniel tried to steer the conversation to lighter topics, asking her about her interests, her career, her travels. She answered curtly, her responses lacking enthusiasm. At one point, he shared a story about a funny mishap at one of his jobs, hoping to make her laugh, but she only smiled thinly, her attention drifting elsewhere. The breaking point came halfway through the meal. Isabella placed her fork down and leaned back in her chair, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the table. "Daniel," she began, her voice carrying a tone of faux concern, "I have to ask, is this really where you saw our date going?" "What do you mean?" he asked, his heart sinking. She sighed, brushing an imaginary strand of hair from her face. "I mean, this." She gestured vaguely to the restaurant, then toward him. "Don't get me wrong, you seem like a nice guy, but I don't think we're on the same page. You know, financially, socially, in life, really." Her words hit him like a slap. He opened his mouth to respond, but found himself at a loss for words. "You're sweet," she continued, her tone not unkind, but utterly dismissive. "But I'm looking for someone who can match my lifestyle, someone who understands what it takes to succeed. And, well..." She trailed off, giving him a pointed look that made it clear he wasn't that someone. Daniel swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "I see," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Isabella stood, grabbing her clutch. "It's nothing personal?" she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But I think we should just call it a night." She left him sitting there, the half-finished plates of pasta and wine glasses between them, feeling like relics of a moment that had crumbled to dust. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from him, her parting words echoing in his mind. As Daniel drove home that night, the Toyota's engine hummed softly, a sound he'd grown used to, but now seemed unbearably loud in the quiet of his thoughts. Her rejection stung, not just because of her words, but because it forced him to confront the harsh reality of his situation. But somewhere, amidst the hurt and humiliation, a fire began to ignite. He didn't hate her for what she'd said. It wasn't in his nature to hold grudges, but her words had awoken something in him, a fierce determination he hadn't felt in years. He pulled up to his small apartment, stepping out into the chilly night. As he stood there, staring up at the stars barely visible through the city's haze, he made a silent vow. One day he would succeed, not to prove her wrong, but to prove to himself that he was more than the sum of his circumstances. She might not have seen his worth, but he would. And he would build a life so full, so rich with meaning and success, that the memory of this night would become nothing more than a stepping stone to something greater. With that thought, Daniel walked inside, ready to begin again. Streamed through the towering glass windows of the corporate high-rise, reflecting off polished surfaces and casting a golden glow over the marble floors. Daniel stood at the edge of the conference room, hands clasped behind his back, his tailored navy suit impeccably pressed. His silhouette was a picture of confidence, but his expression was calm, composed. Behind him, the skyline of the city stretched endlessly, a testament to how far he had come. 10 years. 10 years of relentless grind, sleepless nights, and a determination that refused to falter. The meeting was about to begin, and the boardroom was abuzz with tension. Executives from Sterling Enterprises, a prestigious but failing luxury goods company, shuffled nervously in their seats. It was a family business, once synonymous with class and exclusivity, now teetering on the brink of collapse due to years of mismanagement and shifting market trends. For the past year, rumors of a potential buyout had swirled, but the identity of the savior investor remained a mystery. Until today. Daniel glanced at his watch. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Timing had been everything in his journey. A decade ago, he was a young man scraping by on 2 jobs, facing rejection and humiliation. Today, he stood as the majority shareholder of Sterling Enterprises, the very company that Isabella's family owned. A series of calculated moves, strategic investments, acquisitions, and an uncanny ability to spot opportunities had led him here. But he wasn't here for revenge. He was here because it made sense. The company had potential, and he was in the business of building success stories. As the doors opened, a group of employees entered, carrying stacks of documents and coffee trays. Among them, he spotted her, Isabella. She had changed, though not as much as he had. Her once flawless confidence was tempered by something softer, more subdued. Her makeup was lighter, her posture less commanding, and the expensive designer dresses she once wore had been replaced with a more modest office ensemble. Life had clearly humbled her, though she still carried an air of grace. She didn't notice him at first. She was balancing a tray of coffees, focused on placing them in front of the board members. Daniel stood silently, watching as she moved around the room. He felt no anger, no bitterness, just a strange sense of distance, as if the man who'd once been humiliated on that first date was someone he no longer recognized. Her head was bowed as she set a coffee cup in front of the seat at the head of the table, his seat. She straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and then froze as her eyes met his. Time seemed to stop. Her expression shifted in an instant. Confusion, recognition, disbelief. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Good morning," he said smoothly, offering her a polite nod. His voice was steady, devoid of malice, yet the weight of his presence filled the room. She stared at him, wide-eyed, as if trying to reconcile the man before her with the memory of the young barista she had dismissed a decade ago. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The other executives began to murmur, unaware of the personal history unfolding before them. He broke the silence. "Shall we begin the meeting?" Throughout the presentation, Daniel outlined his vision for the company with clarity and precision. The board members were captivated, nodding along as he explained how he planned to revitalize Sterling Enterprises, expand its market reach, and restore its reputation. Isabella sat at the back of the room, silent, her gaze fixed on him. The man standing before her was unrecognizable, confident, composed, commanding respect with every word. When the meeting concluded, the executives filed out, leaving Daniel alone with her. She hesitated by the door, her hands gripping the tray of empty coffee cups. Finally, she turned to face him. "I didn't know," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know it was you." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I didn't expect you to." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "You've changed." "So have you," he replied, his tone even. She let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Not as much as you, apparently." She hesitated, then added, "You're impressive, Daniel. I mean it." "Thank you." He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "But you don't have to say that. I'm not here to gloat, Isabella." Her eyes widened at his words, guilt flickering across her face. "I deserve it," she admitted. "After how I treated you, after what I said, I was awful, and I'm sorry. I was young and—" She stopped, as if realizing that excuses wouldn't undo the past. Daniel smiled faintly, his expression kind but detached. "You don't owe me an apology. What happened back then? It motivated me. It pushed me to become who I am today. For that, I'm grateful." She blinked, clearly taken aback by his grace. "You're a better person than I ever was," she murmured. He shrugged lightly. "Maybe, or maybe we just needed different lessons to grow." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Then he broke the tension. "I'll see you around the office," he said, his tone professional. "There's a lot of work to be done." Over the weeks that followed, Isabella found herself working under Daniel's leadership. Her role, once one of privilege and influence in her family's company, had been reduced to a mid-level position. She often found herself performing tasks she would have once deemed beneath her, delivering reports, organizing meetings, even fetching coffee. Yet, to her surprise, she didn't resent it. In fact, she began to appreciate the value of hard work and humility, qualities she had once overlooked in others. Daniel, for his part, treated her no differently than any other employee. He was fair, respectful, and focused on the company's success. He never mentioned their past, but never lorded his achievements over her. But she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in their dynamic, the way he carried himself, the quiet authority in his voice. It was a stark contrast to the shy young man she'd dismissed so long ago. One afternoon, she knocked on his office door, a stack of reports in hand. He glanced up from his desk, gesturing for her to enter. "These are the sales projections you asked for," she said, placing the papers in front of him. "Thank you," he replied, his eyes scanning the documents. She lingered for a moment, then took a deep breath. "Daniel, can I ask you something?" He looked up, his expression unreadable. "Of course. Do you ever think about that night?" she asked hesitantly. "Our first date?" He leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "I used to," he admitted, "but not anymore. That night was just one moment in a much larger story." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I've changed, you know," she said quietly. "I'm not the same person I was back then." "I can see that," he said simply. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she saw not just a man who had succeeded, but someone who had found peace within himself. There was no resentment, no lingering anger, just a quiet strength that spoke volumes. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me a chance to prove myself." He smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "We all deserve second chances, Isabella." As she left his office, she felt a strange sense of relief. The past no longer weighed her down, and for the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something new. Hope. Daniel watched her go, then turned back to his work. He wasn't interested in rewriting the past or seeking validation from those who had once doubted him. His success was its own reward, and he had no need for revenge. Life had a way of balancing the scales, and as he continued building his future, he carried no bitterness, only a quiet pride in how far he had come.